Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, this is Book 5 of the Wolfman Chronicles, Episode 62. This is Chapter 11 of Book 5, and it's All Hallows Eve. And this is taking place in Alaska. It was Halloween. Rosa had prepared a dinner of hearty beef stew, thick and rich, with chunks of tender venison, carrots, and potatoes simmered until they were perfectly soft. The smell filled the kitchen, mixing with the earthly aroma of freshly baked bread that she'd pulled from the oven just minutes before. Beside the bread, Rosa had set her famous pumpkin pie, its spiced scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves mingling with the savory stew. She'd topped it with a dollop of whipped cream, flecked with just a hint of vanilla. The table was set simply with mismatched plates, a few rustic candles, their warm glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows, and reminding her that winter was here. But inside, the house was cozy and inviting. The warmth from the giant fireplace in the living room, creating a haven from the chill of Halloween night. As she placed the last of the food on the table, she glanced at the door, hoping that Grizzly might show up, as he'd returned to his cabin earlier, eager to check on his mule, Molly. He'd been spending a lot of time up at the big house. Now that he was gone, Rosa was missing him. Outside, the snow was still falling. Rosa had checked the driveway several times, hoping to see Grizzly's old pickup coming up the narrow road that led through the forest from his cabin down below. If he didn't arrive soon, she thought, he wouldn't be able to plow through that snow and he'd miss the festivities. Being so far away from town, it didn't seem very important to celebrate Halloween. Yet Rosa insisted that they at least honor the dead with candles and food. Dia de la Muerta, or the Day of the Dead, is a uniquely Mexican tradition, a time when families remember and honor their deceased loved ones, believing that the spirits return to visit. With this time of year overlapping with Halloween, many Mexican children participate by donning costumes and trick-or-treating. See, Halloween is not widely celebrated in Russia. The government has taken steps to ban it altogether. Many Russian politicians and government officials considered it a Western cultural influence, and they decreed that all Halloween celebrations be canceled. However, some have tried to create a Russian alternative to Halloween, and they call it a Pumpkin Savior's Day, as a fake festival in line with Russian culture and spirit. The holiday, it was meant to be a counterpoint to the blood, the ghosts, and the witches of Halloween. So the fact that it was Halloween didn't particularly feel like a reason for celebrating. But the fact that Sasha was home, safe and sound, and Natya and Igor were there, seemed reason enough for a party. They'd invited Carl to come for the evening and asked him to stay over since they were expecting snow. Rosa assumed he'd stop by Grizzly's cabin first if he saw the pickup parked outside. Juanita had instructed Sasha and Nadia in how to create vibrant crepe paper flowers, each bloom a burst of color that adorned every corner of the house. Numerous candles flickered on every available surface, casting a warm golden glow that danced along the walls and the ceiling. The soft glow made the paper flowers seem even more vibrant, casting their colors in warm hues across the room. For Rosa, it was a comforting reminder of family and tradition. It was a link to the past, amidst the tumult of the past few days. Jack had been on the phone for hours, attempting to hire a crew to come out and place a satellite tower on the property. That's so they'd have phone service. Everyone agreed that finding a way to communicate by phone, by satellite, or radio was critical after the past week of searching for Sasha. At first it felt rather safe not being able to be reached by anyone, that they had felt remote and protected, being so far away from civilization out in the Alaskan wilderness. But now they realized just how crucial it is to be able to reach one another should they be separated for whatever reason or lost. Julian and Igor both sat in armchairs by the massive fireplace, keeping the fire stoked while absorbed in the books they were reading. Igor had found an old copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace, while Julian was reading an Ellery Queen mystery anthology. Neither of them were the least bit interested in participating in the Halloween festivities. They were content to sit in front of the fire and escape into their books. Jack wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of the molasses cookies coming out of the oven. "Now, Jack, how about driving down to Grizzly's and making sure he's all right? With all this snow, I'm worried he can't make it up here in his truck," Rosa asked. Jack grabbed a couple cookies off the plate and smiled at Rosa. "Sure thing," he replied as Rosa shooed him out of the kitchen. He found Sasha hanging a garland of colorful lights on the railing of the deck outside and asked if she wanted to come with him down to Grizzly's cabin to check on him. She gave him a kiss and sent him on his way. "Hey, Miguel, why don't you come with me?" Jack remarked as he walked past Miguel sitting in a chair on the deck, snow falling on his shoulders and turning his dark hair white. He'd been sitting on the deck all afternoon just gazing at the forest, not wanting to talk with anyone or engage in any of the Halloween preparations. Miguel simply stared ahead and didn't answer. Jack looked at Sasha and shrugged his shoulders. Miguel had been unusually quiet the last couple days. Shortly after Jack and Sasha had arrived, Miguel had handed her the jewel and told them that the Mavka had returned it. "Fantastic," Jack had exclaimed at the time. "Good job, Miguel." Miguel had merely nodded and walked away, not wanting to explain how he'd gotten it back from the Mavka. And since then, he'd just kind of stuck to himself, avoiding everyone in the household as much as possible. Well, the snow continued to fall, and as Sasha was brushing the flakes off her head and her jacket, she asked Miguel to come on inside. "Well, you're going to catch your death of cold out here, Miguel. You're absolutely covered in snow. Come on in by the fire and warm up a bit." Miguel looked up at her with a glazed expression on his face, but turned his face back to the woods without saying a word. Sasha quietly shut the door and let Miguel be. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming mug of hot buttered rum and a blanket. "Please, Miguel, I'm worried about you. Drink this and then come inside when you're ready." He smiled softly and took the mug from her hands, but he wouldn't take the blanket. Sasha opened it and placed it gently around his shoulders and his wet hair, then placed her hand on his shoulder. He reached up and he took her hand just for a moment and said thank you in a quiet voice. It was the most words she'd heard him speak in the last couple days, and it brought tears to her eyes. She wished she could ask him what was wrong. What had he given the Mavka to encourage her to give him the jewel? Why was he acting so strange? Miguel sat motionless in the falling snow, his gaze fixed into the depths of the forest, as if he could see something no one else could. His shoulders were hunched, burdened by an invisible weight, and he held that steaming mug Sasha had given him like it was the only warmth left in his world. Sasha watched him from the doorway, her heart heavy with worry. She knew that something had happened out there with the Mavka, something he hadn't shared, something that had drained the light out of him. As the snowflakes settled onto his dark hair, slowly melting against the warmth of his skin, he didn't seem to notice. Sasha watched him, thinking that the Miguel she knew would have shaken them off with a grin, flashing that mischievous smile that could charm anyone in the room. But this Miguel, the one sitting silently in the snow, was a stranger to her. Miguel was normally the life of the party, any party. To see him so despondent was troubling. Wrapped in a warm parka, Sasha pulled a chair up beside Miguel and lifted her face to the falling snow. Please talk to me, she whispered. Tell me what's wrong. They sat in silence for several moments, then finally, Miguel spoke, his voice barely audible. Sometimes, Sasha, we make bargains we don't fully understand. His eyes met hers, shadowed and distant, filled with a sorrow that chilled her more than the winter air. Sasha's brow furrowed. What did you give her, Miguel? She whispered, as if speaking too loudly would shatter him. He shook his head. It doesn't matter, he murmured, but the haunted look in his eyes told her that it mattered more than she could imagine. The Mavka, she has her own sense of justice, a different way of balancing things. Sasha's heart ached to reach out to him, to ask him to explain, but she could feel the weight of his silence pressing down, as heavy as the snow building on the trees. Whatever he had given up to retrieve that jewel, it was something more than physical. A piece of himself, perhaps. Something he could never get back. The silence stretched between them as Sasha reached over and took his hand, offering him the only comfort she could. I'll be inside if you need anything, she said softly, rising from her chair and brushing the snow off her jacket. He nodded, his gaze falling once more to the shadowed, snowy woods. She could feel the words he left unspoken hanging in the air. The Mavka's bargain was his alone to carry. Whatever she had taken from him, it had left him a changed man. As she walked back inside, a sudden chill ran through her, the kind that lingered not on the skin but deep in the bones. She could sense that Miguel's troubles had just begun, and whatever price he had paid, it was only the beginning of a debt that would haunt him for a long, long time. Headlights broke through the trees as Jack's truck plowed through the snow and into the driveway, followed closely by Carl's truck. Rosa watched out the window as Grizzly stepped out of the truck, and a wave of relief flooded through her. As they stepped inside, stomping their feet to relieve their boots of snow, Carl announced, "You might just get stuck with me a bit. Looks like we're in for a deep one." Rosa rushed over and started taking everyone's wet coats and hats and hanging them in the mudroom. "I was so worried," she exclaimed. "Got stuck," Grizzly grumbled. "My truck's back at the cabin. Carl was going to drive us both up here, but his truck got stuck. Good thing Jack come along to pull us out." Grizzly wrapped his arms around Rosa, patting her back gently but looking as gruff as ever. "Don't you go worrying about me, Rosa. Takes more than a bit of snow to keep me away." He winked at her. Carl shook his head with a chuckle, shaking off his coat and handing it to Rosa. "If this storm keeps up, none of us are going anywhere for a while," he said, glancing out the window where the snow was already covering the tracks they had just made. The snow was casting a thick, ghostly blanket over everything. "Roads are a mess between here and Fairbanks," Carl exclaimed. "I wasn't sure I was going to get here." Well, Rosa bustled everyone through the kitchen into the living room in front of the fire where she had placed trays of thick slices of homemade bread, cheese, and venison salami. As they all settled around the fire, Grizzly pulled a chair close to the fire, stretched his legs with a contented sigh. Rosa glanced over, noting the weariness in his face. She moved beside him, gently draping a blanket over his shoulders. Grizzly grumbled, "I'm fine, Rosa. Don't need fussing over," but Rosa noticed a sparkle in his eye as he said it. Sasha came out of the kitchen carrying a large tray of mugs filled with hot buttered rum. "It's Halloween, and if there's ever a night for a little comfort, it's tonight." Carl smiled as he took a mug off the tray. "It's been many a year since I celebrated a Halloween night. How about some stories to pass the time? You got any werewolf stories, Sasha?" He chuckled. Grizzly gave him a skeptical look, but Nadia's face lit up. "Yes, let's tell some stories. Who's got a good one to share?" Carl leaned forward, his face casting shadows as the fire crackled. "I know a few good tales," he began, his voice dropping low and mysterious. Tales that make your skin crawl and remind you why folks don't wander off in a storm. The wind began howling outside, rattling the windows as if echoing Carl's words. Grizzly rolled his eyes, but even he seemed to sit a little closer to the fire. "Where's Miguel?" asked Jack as he glanced around the room. Sasha nodded to the porch and shot Jack a worried look. Jack quietly got up and walked over to the big sliding door leading to the deck. Miguel was so covered in snow that he looked almost like a snowman. Jack stepped outside. "Hey, man, you need to come inside. You're going to freeze to death out here." He reached over and took Miguel's arm. Miguel startled at Jack's touch as if he'd been miles away. He looked up, his expression dazed, and he gave a weak nod. Just thinking," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack noticed Miguel's hands were shaking, his lips tinged blue. "Thinking can wait. You need to warm up," he said firmly, steering Miguel out of his chair and inside the house. And as they stepped into the warmth of the room, Carl paused his story, watching Miguel with a furrowed brow. Rosa quickly fetched a warm blanket, taking Miguel's wet one and replacing it with the dry one. Sasha handed him another hot drink. "You're freezing, Miguel," she said softly, worry etched in her face. Miguel took a sip of the hot cider, his eyes far away. "I saw her," he murmured, almost to himself. "She was there, standing just beyond the trees, watching me, waiting for me." Carl glanced at Grizzly. "Who's he talking about? Who's out there?" Grizzly slowly looked up from his drink. "The Mavka," he said to Carl. Carl took a deep breath and shook his head. He knew exactly who Grizzly was talking about. He walked over, placed his big warm hand on Miguel's shoulder. "What did she take from you?" he asked. Miguel looked into Carl's eyes for a moment, then glanced around the room. All eyes were on him, waiting for his answer. She took something I can't get back." Jack frowned, glancing between Miguel and Sasha. "What are you talking about?" Miguel didn't answer. Instead, he looked up, his gaze distant and hollow. I think she took a piece of my soul. She asked me for a child, but that is one thing I cannot give. So instead, I gave her..." He paused, as if unable to utter the words. He took a deep breath. "I gave her myself." Well, there was a silence in the room, broken only by the shuffling and the sparking of the wood in the fireplace. Carl cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Well, now, that's one hell of a Halloween tale," he said, his voice forced and light, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Carl knew, better than anyone in the room, just what Miguel had given up. He knew that Miguel's words were more than just a tale, that something dark and ancient had taken his soul. Carl knew because he too had given his life to a Mavka, many, many years ago. It was a secret he'd never told anyone. It was the reason he never married. He'd never left Alaska. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if the night itself held secrets too dark to be spoken. And in the firelight, Miguel's shadow on the wall seemed to flicker and twist, almost as if something else was moving just beyond the edge of the light. Rosa, watching the men's faces, could sense the weight of unspoken truths thickening the air. She shivered, pulling her shawl closer, feeling a strange chill that the crackling fire just couldn't dispel. "Miguel, is there anything we can do?" she began, but her voice faltered as he turned to her, his eyes dark with resignation. "Nothing can be done," Carl answered softly. "Once a Mavka takes a piece of you, it's hers. She's patient, but she'll come back to collect, one way or another." Then in a low voice he whispered, "I'm sorry, Miguel. I know what it's like to have one foot in the world of the living and one foot in hers." On Carl's face was a mask of memories that he kept buried. He'd spent years running from his own debt to the Mavka, hoping that by burying it deep in his past he'd somehow escaped her claim. But Miguel's words had stirred old fears, bringing shadows he thought long forgotten. Miguel's eyes focused on Carl, his voice barely a whisper. "Then you know, there's no way out, don't you?" Carl gave a small nod, the weight of years bearing down on him. "There's always a way out," he murmured, but his words were hollow and empty. Grizzly, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood with a low chuckle. "Well, if she's a-comin' to collect, she'll have to fight through this storm first." But even he couldn't shake the unease in his voice. For the next hour they sat by the fire, drinking in silence, occasionally murmuring words of reassurance that no one quite believed. Outside the wind wailed, rattling the windows and clawing at the walls as if something sought entry. The snow piled high against the door, trapping them in the cabin, sealing them in with the oppressive weight of Miguel's confession. The spiked cider and hot buttered rum was beginning to take effect, lightening everyone's mood just a little bit. Rosa brought out bowls of stew to the table and everyone sat, the conversation turning to lighter subjects. Laughter and warmth began to fill the room again. The fire crackled, casting a golden glow over the faces around the table as they dug into Rosa's delicious meal. And for a while, the eerie tension that had lingered all night seemed to dissolve a bit. Miguel, though quiet, managed a small smile as he sipped his cider. Even Grizzly let out a deep, rumbling laugh at one of Carl's stories. Jack leaned back in his chair, a contented sigh escaping his lips. "Now this is what Halloween should be about," he said, raising his mug in a toast. "Good food, good friends, and a good fire on a snowy night." They all clinked their glasses, the clatter echoing in the cozy room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, muffling the sounds of the wild. But as the laughter died down, Miguel's gaze once again drifted to the window. In the dim reflection, he could swear he saw something, no, someone, standing just beyond the window, pale and watching. A figure with eyes that glinted like ice, piercing right through him. His heart thudded in his chest, and he tore his gaze away, gripping his mug tightly. For a moment he considered telling the others, asking if they saw her too, but he stopped himself. Rosa noticed his unease and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe here, Miguel," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth and understanding. He managed a small nod, grateful but unable to shake the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He hoped for just a few more hours with his friends, a few more hours where he could pretend he was free of her haunting presence. Meanwhile, far off in the distance, a white wolf padded silently through the thick snow, her pale coat blending seamlessly with the icy landscape. Her eyes, a deep and knowing blue, gleamed under a thin sliver of moonlight that pierced through the clouds. She moved with purpose, each step as silent as the snowfall itself, as though she were nothing more than a phantom drifting through the winter night. The wolf stopped atop a ridge, her ears pricked forward, catching the faintest traces of laughter and warmth carried on the wind. She sensed the pulse of life from afar, the firelight, the laughter, the clinking of mugs. The wolf's eyes narrowed, and her lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. With a low, haunting howl, she threw her head back, sending a chilling call through the night. The sound echoed through the valleys, bouncing off of trees and carried by the wind until it reached the very walls of the log house where Miguel sat restlessly by the fire. A shiver ran through him as her call pulled at something deep within his soul. He muttered incoherently, his fingers twitching, as if trying to grasp something that wasn't even there. And as the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in silence, the white wolf settled down in the shadows to wait, a sentinel in the night. As the night wore on, stories turned to memories, and memories to quiet murmurs. One by one they drifted off to bed, leaving Miguel and Jack alone by the dying fire. The flames had dimmed to a soft, smoldering glow, casting faint shadows that danced along the walls, whispering secrets of their own. The room was quiet, save for the crackling of the last embers and the soft sighs of the wind against the windows. Jack glanced over at Miguel, who sat staring into the embers. His face was lined with a loss that lingered in his gaze like a shadow. Miguel's eyes were distant, following something beyond the dying light of the fire, as if looking past the walls, past the trees, to something waiting just out of sight. "I'm worried about you, Miguel. What are we going to do about this?" Jack asked softly, breaking the silence. Miguel didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, shoulders rising and falling with the weight of something just unspeakable. Finally, he nodded, though it was more to himself than to Jack. "There are things we do in life that we can never take back. Promises we keep, debts we owe. Sometimes they follow us, even when we think they're gone." His voice was barely more than a whisper. "There's got to be a way to undo this, Miguel," Jack had said. "We'll give her back the damn jewel, or whatever she'll take." There's no undoing this one," Miguel replied. "I don't think I'll ever be free of her." They sat in silence for a long while, both men staring into the fading fire, as if the dying flames held answers to the problem at hand. Outside, the wind had quieted, the world falling into a heavy, expectant hush. Then came a sound, a low, mournful howl, rising from somewhere out in the forest. It was distant, yet close, a call that seemed to tremble in the air, reaching through the night to press against the walls of the log house. The sound was haunting. It was the call of a wolf. Jack felt an instinctual urge to shut the blinds, to lock the doors, as if the simple act of closing himself off from the outside world would keep whatever lingered out there at bay. But something in Miguel's expression stopped him, kind of a quiet surrender, a knowing that no door, no lock could keep that Mavka from what was hers. Together they sat there watching the flames flicker and fade, while outside the Mavka waited, as patient as the snow. And just as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, a soft tapping came from the frosted window. It was a sound that only Miguel heard, a summons that he felt in his bones. The Mavka had come to collect. As dawn broke, Jack rose from the chair he had fallen asleep in. He glanced across at the sofa where he had last seen Miguel. The sofa was empty, the blankets lying in a heap on the floor. And as Jack walked to the sliding door and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, he could have sworn he saw Miguel's figure standing out by the tree line, shrouded in mist. Just another spirit caught between two worlds, waiting for the snow to cover his tracks.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope we'll see you all here next week for the next installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. Have a great week, everyone.